Welcome, everyone, to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures. Today, we will have part 2 of the Sultana. If you didn't listen to part 1, probably a good idea to go back and listen to that. There's a lot of intrigue and bribery and just people doing bad deeds that all contributed to this disaster, so go ahead and listen to that one if you haven't already. As you recall, we left off with the Sultana departing Vicksburg heading north on the Mississippi River. It was spring, and the ice that had melted in the north was feeding the Mississippi River. The river was flooding over the banks, there were rough currents, and muddy, turbulent water. The Mississippi River is a very winding, meandering river, and its course changes even over very short periods of time as the river's massive water tries to just find the path of least resistance. And even today, the river is difficult to navigate, and the flooded river in April of 1865 made it even more so. Steamboats on the Mississippi used water from the river as the source for its boilers to produce steam. As sediment from the muddy water builds up in a steam engine, it increases the internal pressure. Boilers require frequent cleaning and scraping, especially those operating in the Mississippi. In fact, the boiler of the Sultana had been cleaned when it reached New Orleans and then again before it departed Vicksburg, and Chief Engineer Wintringer himself oversaw those operations. Heading north on the river meant going against the strong current, which requires even more careful navigation and even more power from the boilers. Problems with the boilers on the Sultana appear to have been an ongoing problem known to Captain Mason and Wintringer. At the very least, they were both intimately aware of the most recent leaking boiler and the makeshift patch that was applied by Taylor back in Vicksburg. First Clerk William Gambrill was still concerned as the boat continued its journey up the river. Gambrill met with Major Fridler, who shared his concerns earlier, and asked him to order his men on the top deck to remain still and not make any sudden movements in order to prevent capsizing. Fridler ordered his men to keep quiet, especially in case of an accident, and not to change places when the boat was stopped. Captain Mason gave Fidler the same warning before they arrived at Helena, Arkansas. Mason was not as optimistic as he appeared to be prior to leaving Vicksburg, however. He did everything he could to get all the prisoners from Camp Fisk, but he seemed to regret having made these arrangements at this point. Mason could often be seen drinking at the Sultana's bar. Some survivors later recalled that he wasn't actually drunk, but many others report seeing him visibly drunk and barely able to stand. A passenger named Joseph Elliott had a brief exchange with Captain Mason, and Mason told him he would gladly give all the interest he had in the boat if it was safely landed in Cairo. Mason was later seen by other passengers crawling along the floor trying to reach his cabin. That's not good either, that Mason, the captain of the ship, is incapacitated and seemingly not having too much confidence now in the Sultana. When the Sultana arrived in Helena on April 25th to drop off some of its cargo, a photographer happened to be nearby and noticed the large steamer absolutely brimming with humanity. The photographer then took the last and only known photograph of the Sultana. In the photo, it is noticeably listing, and the ship was quite obviously packed from top to bottom. You can see this photo in the episode show notes. On April 26th, the Sultana made another stop in Memphis, Tennessee. It was on this day that John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's assassin, was found and killed by Union cavalry. While in Memphis, the Sultana offloaded more cargo and gave passengers who were healthy enough time to go into town for a few hours. And most likely, all the people that got off the Sultana and went into town were going to be drinking, celebrating. They were happy to be going home. At 11 p.m., the Sultana was back underway, stopping briefly across the river in Arkansas to receive a load of coal. By midnight, the ship was steaming north of Memphis, and Chief Engineer Wintringer gave control of the boilers over to his second engineer, Samuel Clemens. Now, this is an interesting coincidence, but this was not the same Samuel Clemens who wrote under the name Mark Twain. Concerns continued to grow on the Sultana, and many struggled to find space even to lie down. There were men lying in all areas of the ship, on all the decks, including very near the boilers. Wintringer had been noticeably monitoring the boilers, checking and rechecking them. Nevertheless, the former prisoners were joyful to be returning home after their nightmarish ordeal. Little did they know the real nightmare was yet to come. As the ship was passing through a very tricky section of the river north of Memphis called Patty's Hen and Chicks, the Sultana's pilot, George Caton, was struggling to navigate through the multiple islands and bends in the river. Captain Mason had retired for the night, and Caton was joined by Chief Mate William Rowberry in the pilot house. The ship was cruising along at 9 miles per hour, and Second Engineer Clemens was monitoring the boiler. Suddenly, at 2 a.m. on April 27th, a massive explosion ripped through the Sultana. 3 out of the Sultana's 4 boilers erupted in a tremendous blast of scalding steam and flames. The boilers were located in the middle of the ship and exploded straight upward and also outward at 45 degrees. Flaming shards of metal and wood were blasted through passengers, destroying the pilot house directly above, eliminating all hope of regaining control of the ship. The flimsy and cost-cutting construction of the decks resulted in their immediate collapse, crushing those underneath, pummeling them with flaming debris. Many were blown off the ship and into the river. Others awoke from their sleep to find themselves flying through the air before crashing down into the frigid water. Many were instantly killed by the blast, including those who were cozied up very near the boilers to keep warm. Survivor A.C. Brown wrote, "Hundreds of my compadres were fastened down by the timbers of the decks and had to burn, while the water seemed to be one solid mass of human beings struggling with the waves. The light and the screams at this time cannot be described." Another survivor, Nicholas Carnes from Ohio, wrote, "Everywhere steam was escaping, women were screaming, soldiers and crew cursing and swearing, horses neighing, mules braying, splinters flying." Many who remained on board the Sultana had scrambled toward the bow, as the wind was causing the flames to spread toward the stern. Just a little boating vocabulary here. Bow is the front of the ship, while stern is the rear of the ship. Desperate passengers hurled themselves into the river wherever they could, but the river below was teeming with human carnage, just groping at each other, grabbing, pulling each other down. All was confusion. Men were jumping into the river by the hundreds. I saw at least 20 drown at once. As fast as one would feel he was drowning, he would clutch at the nearest person. And I believe many a bold swimmer was drowned that night who could have saved himself alone. This is a quote from survivor William H. Norton. Ropes and other items were thrown to the people below in hopes they could hold on for dear life. Safety had not really been a concern from the very beginning. The Sultana only had 76 life jackets on board and carried only 1 lifeboat and 1 small yawl. Now, a yawl is a small boat that we might call a launch now, meant for transporting a small number of people to and from shore. When the ship's 1 lifeboat was actually launched, a mad scramble resulted and the lifeboat became overcrowded and swamped and eventually sunk. Survivor J. Walter Elliott said, "There seemed to be acres of struggling humanity on the waters, some on debris of the wreck, some on dead carcasses of horses, some holding to swimming live horses, some on boxes, bales of hay, drift logs. Soon we parted company with the wreck and drifted out into the darkness, almost alone." Chester Berry, whose book we have quoted previously, was on board the Sultana that night. He writes, "The water was literally black with human beings, many of whom were sinking and taking others with them." Barry also describes seeing a man stuck between the flaming wheelhouse and the deck. The man was caught and was burned alive, and that image haunted him throughout the rest of his life. Captain Mason, who had been asleep in his cabin, later was seen moving about the survivors on the deck, offering assistance and asking for everyone to please remain calm. People were groaning and screaming as they suffered burns from the flames and scalding steam. Some who were trapped under the wreckage were pleading and screaming for help. Bodies of passengers and crew were strewn all about the decks, some whole and some not. It was truly a story made of nightmares. Some of the injured rolled themselves into the water, preferring death over the prolonged agony. The steamboat General Boynton passed the flaming wreck of the Sultana, but didn't stop to help. It can only be assumed that the captain knew that any attempts to help would be futile, and he steamed ahead to Memphis to get help. The Sultana was 2 miles to shore on either side of the swollen river, so swimming to safety was difficult, if not impossible. Some drifted close enough to shore for locals to pull survivors out of the river. There were many reports of Southern Confederates rescuing Union soldiers out of the freezing river. Those who would survive were fortunate enough not to have been pulled down by other victims. Others found debris from the ship, or even dead horses and mules, and were able to float away from the wreck to be rescued later. The explosion and flames could be seen by many in the surrounding areas. Residents watched as the flaming hulk drifted south in the current of the river. They could hear the wailing and cries of the dying. Crew members aboard 2 United States gunboats in Memphis could see the glowing fire in the distance, but chose not to attempt a rescue at that time. It wasn't until the steamer Bostonia II approached Memphis, where it found the river littered with the dead and dying, that real help arrived. Captain John T. Watson ordered the ship's yawl to be launched and to immediately throw out the ship's lines and anything else that would float. In all, the Bostonia's yawl made 9 trips back and forth, and the ship's crew and even civilian passengers helped with the rescue. As bodies and survivors floated down the river toward Memphis, many took notice and sprung into action. Military and private boats alike assisted with the rescue, including the USS Grosbeak, USS Tyler, and the USS Essex. Bodies were laid along the riverside in pine coffins or were covered in blankets. In fact, so many coffins were used that the city of Memphis ran out of coffins. Many who survived the blast, the fire, the steam, and the mass of humanity in the water later succumbed to hypothermia, passed out, and went to the bottom of the cold river. All that would survive would be rescued within 12 hours. But bodies were still being discovered weeks later, some as far away as Vicksburg. In all, 197 bodies were discovered. All the remaining who died would be lost forever to the river. The surviving prisoners were placed on other steamers and transported to Camp Chase in Ohio. Many were understandably apprehensive to board another steamship. The bodies of Captain James Cass Mason and ship's clerk William Gambrill were never found. Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer was able to hold on to some debris until it became lodged in some trees. He would later be rescued by one of the rescue boats. Chester Berry suffered a fractured skull after being struck by a flying timber. He would survive by wading and jumping into the river after it was clear of people. He found a board from the ship to hold onto and floated down the river until being caught by a tree limb. He remained stuck until morning when he was rescued by the Pocahontas. Sultana pilot George Caton was miraculously not injured. First mate William Rowberry also survived, but second engineer Samuel Clemens was burned over almost his entire body. He would later die of his burns. Lieutenant Harvey Annis and his young child sadly drowned in the river, but his wife, Ann Annis, did manage to survive. Lieutenant Annis gave her one of the few life preservers that were aboard the ship. Major W.H. Fiddler, commanding officer of the prisoners on board, who voiced his concerns to Mason about the ship, died in the wreck. Investigation into the disaster began immediately, the first of which, led by Major General Cadwallader C. Washburn, began just hours after the explosion. Lengthy investigations followed, and the issue of bribery soon became apparent. Hatch's clerk, George Denton, testified that the steamboat lines were openly competing to receive as many men as possible, offering as much as 50 cents per man in kickbacks. He personally witnessed a runner for one of the lines enter Captain Kern's office proclaiming, "If it takes money to get 'em, we have as much as anybody." Lieutenant Tillinghast admitted to having entertained bribes from William Jones, agent of the Pauline Carroll. Tillinghast specifically implicated Frederick Speed in the bribery scheme, claiming Speed told him a week before that all the men would be put on the Sultana. Tillinghast stopped short of admitting to taking bribes from Captain Mason, but instead He claimed it was Speed who had received bribes from Mason. William Jones claimed he never once met with Speed, but he did meet with Hatch and told him there were 2,000 to 2,500 men waiting to be transported. Clearly, Reuben Hatch knew the true number of prisoners to be transported. Captain George Williams placed the blame squarely on Captain Kearns. He told the commission that his duty was to get the prisoners from Camp Fisk to Vicksburg, and that it was Kearns' job to get them on the boats. He insisted that he never chose the Sultana as the sole boat to transport the men. But this isn't exactly true. Williams suspected Speed was accepting bribes from the Pauline Carroll, and this is why he refused to put any of the men on the ship. But he also testified that it was Lieutenant Tillinghast who informed him that Speed was accepting bribes, when, in fact, it was Tillinghast who was accepting the bribes. The testimony of Colonel Reuben Hatch was just creative nonsense. Not surprisingly, he again claimed to have no hand in the prisoner transfer or the placement on the boats, claiming that he warned against putting more than 1,500 on the Sultana, and his preference was to place up to 1,000 men on other boats. But this testimony is problematic. Hatch was approached by Kearns numerous times, and each time Hatch refused to get involved. He also knew about the estimate of 2,000 to 2,500 men on board from his previous meetings with Lieutenant Tillinghast and William Jones. Not once did he stop the boarding of the men, check on the safety of the men, or inquire with any of the ship's officers. He routinely shrugged off responsibility for any part of the prisoner transfer, despite being the chief quartermaster of Vicksburg. In his book, The Sultana Tragedy, Jerry Potter writes, Vicksburg was essentially a cesspool of corrupt and incompetent officials in 1865. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most corrupt, Reuben Hatch would be a 12. Recalling that fateful night, Reverend Chester D. Berry added his own thoughts of the situation and of Reuben Hatch. He wrote, "We remained at Camp Fisk for about 20 days. Then 1,965 prisoners were placed on board the Sultana, where there were already a number of passengers and 35 exchanged officers, the entire number of persons being a little over 2,300. I understood at the time, and have had no reason to change my mind, that it was a contrived plan with the United States quartermaster at Vicksburg and the captain of the boat." And the two men he's referring to there are Colonel Reuben Hatch and Captain James Cass Mason. Author of The Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster, Jerry Potter.
I became obsessed with Reuben Hatch. I mean, me and my family actually drove to Springfield, Illinois to do research because I knew he was a crook. And I knew, and as a lawyer, it was like, I have to find all the evidence that I can to prove that he was a crook. And I think I did.
The Washburn Commission wrapped up its investigation and released its report, which concluded the boiler was defective, and the explosion was the result of insufficient water supply to the boiler. It also censured the quartermaster department in Vicksburg for failing to perform its duty and assert itself properly. The report specifically put blame on Captain Speed, stating, "The Adjutant General of the Department of Mississippi is censurable for taking upon himself duties not properly belonging to him." Washburn himself disagreed with the commission's findings. In a letter to the Secretary of War, he wrote that he did not believe the quartermaster department was censurable, and he defended the actions of Hatch and Kearns. Now, why he defended Hatch, I don't know, but he wrote, "All the parties belonging to the boat who were in any wise responsible for the disaster lost their lives at the time of the explosion or have since died." This statement is the first sign that the Army really just wanted this to disappear. They were in no hurry to implicate Army officers for the deaths of 2,200 people. General Dana would launch his own investigation into the matter, and he concluded that it was Speed who had full and active management and control over the transfer of men from Camp Fisk, and it was Captain Kearns' responsibility to get them boarded safely on the boats. A third investigation by Brigadier General Hoffman found Hatch, Speed, Williams, and Kearns all responsible with hatch and speed being the most censurable. A fair amount of criticism was also launched at General Morgan Smith, although it really stopped short of holding him directly responsible. Ultimately, the Washburn Commission's report was sent to Quartermaster General of the United States, General M.C. Meigs. After reviewing the report, Meigs wrote to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, placing blame on Speed and the officers of the Quartermaster's Department, recommending Hatch and Kearns be court-martialed. Stanton then ordered Reuben Hatch to stand trial. Captain Frederick Speed was formally court-martialed and charged with neglect of duty to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. He was found guilty and dismissed from the Army, and the judgment was upheld by Major General Thomas J. Wood. This decision was forwarded to Secretary of War Stanton, who then sent it on to Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt. However, Holt dismissed the charges against Speed, fully exonerating him, citing Speed was at Camp Fisk during the loading of the Sultana and could not possibly be at fault.
I met his niece, Frederick Speed's niece, many years ago. We were actually at a meeting of the descendants of the Sultana survivors. I think we were in Vicksburg, and she came and she was very apologetic. I said, "Ma'am, Frederick Speed was a scapegoat. He really did not do anything wrong and should not have been punished. He was, if anything, he allowed George Williams and Reuben Hatch to overrule his what Speed wanted to do. Because if Speed had gotten his way, the men would never have been placed on the Sultana. I felt sorry for Speed. I think he was he was probably 21, 22, 23 years old. He was a captain, uh, and he just didn't stand up to George Williams. He should have. Um, so if there was any fault, it was the fact that he allowed George Williams to overrule his decisions not to place the men on the Sultana.
As for the specific cause of this tragedy, some believe the Sultana was the victim of Confederate sabotage with a coal torpedo. These were small devices with explosives hidden inside lumps of coal, basically. And theories and rumors about this would spread over the years, but there was never any evidence to indicate that this was true. Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer faced intense scrutiny during the investigations and the possible loss of his engineer's license.
Chief engineers were licensed by the government, and they were responsible for the condition of the boilers and the machinery. And that's the reason that they were licensed. They were supposed to have sufficient knowledge as to the safety requirements and safety features in order to make sure that a boiler would not explode. R.G. Taylor, the local boilermaker that ended up placing that thin patch over the buckled area, when he completed the work on the afternoon of April 24th, he told Wintinger that the boiler was not safe after being repaired. And the chief engineer told Taylor that not to worry, he would have the boiler repaired again more permanently when the boat reached St. Louis. In my book, I said it was probably the patch that failed that ultimately led to the explosion. Since the book has come out, we have had boiler engineers and who have investigated this, and they have concluded that the patch may have played a small role, but it was really com- the design of the boilers, which really wasn't safe for the lower Mississippi River because it was very difficult to clean the mud and the silt out of the boilers, and they would have hot spots that would cause the metal to become brittle. Also, the metal that was used in the four boilers became very brittle and subject to failing. So there was several reasons that ultimately led to the explosion, but the boilers should have been repaired in a much safer fashion while the boat was at Vicksburg. And if those types of permanent repairs had been done, the men would not have been placed on the Sultana because it was going to take several days for Taylor to do the complete repair job that he wanted to do, but ultimately was not allowed to do. So Wintinger should have had his license revoked as a chief engineer, and there was an investigation, but ultimately the government concluded that it was not going to revoke Wintinger's license.
Captain George Williams was never charged with wrongdoing. Williams was a regular Army officer, and the military inquiries most likely chose not to indict him. He would continue his military career, achieving the rank of major, and died in 1889. Although never implicated with any wrongdoing, Major General Dana resigned from the Army a month later. After a successful career in the railroad industry, he died in 1905 at age 83. General Morgan L. Smith resigned from the Army in 1865 and was briefly the Assistant Postmaster General under Grant's administration. He was later accused of receiving kickbacks for awarding government shipping contracts, and he died very mysteriously in a hotel room in 1874, and that itself could be a great story to tell. On June 3, 1865, Colonel Reuben Hatch was relieved of duty, citing the previous determination that Hatch was mentally unfit for the job. Hatch was later found to have mishandled over $14,000 in government funds, resulting in the loss of over $8,000. The Army found Hatch liable for the loss, and he was honorably discharged in July of 1865. Hatch then went on the run and he disappeared, essentially, and officials were unable to locate him. Hatch never stood trial for any of his crimes regarding the Sultana. Reuben Hatch died in 1871. Lieutenant Tillinghast deserted from the military shortly after the accident with the Sultana. He was later jailed for forgery in an incident unrelated to the Sultana. In September of 1866, Speed was honorably discharged from the Army and would go on to be a judge in the state of Mississippi. He died in 1911 in Vicksburg, where the city named a street after him. Frederick Speed was the only man formally charged for the disaster of the Sultana. Ultimately, nobody was held responsible for the deaths of roughly 2,200 people. In his book, Jerry Potter writes the Army, quote, absolved itself of any wrongdoing in the sacrifice of so many lives. Following the tragedy, reports varied greatly regarding the number of people that were on board and subsequently how many died. Even today, sources don't really agree on this number. Here's Jerry Potter to give us his thoughts regarding these discrepancies.
The Army did not know how many men had been placed on the Sultana on the 24th. So that was a problem. Then the newspaper accounts, they actually listed the names of the people that the men and passengers and crewmen that were on the Sultana, in the stories after the explosion. And there were a lot of errors and mistakes. And the government reported at the time, shortly after the accident, that 1,500 men had died. And that turned out to be inaccurate. And Gene Saliker, who has written 2 books on the Sultana, dear friend of mine, we have worked together over the years, and his book came out in 1996, and my book came out in 1992. And I had actually given Gene all my original records from the archives to write his book. So he became a dear friend of mine for that. So Gene was able to determine that there were probably 1,200 that died on the Sultana, and there were probably closer to around 2,200 instead of 2,500 on the Sultana when the boat exploded. The government didn't know how many it had placed on the Sultana at Vicksburg. The newspaper accounts were wrong. The military estimates about the number of people on the Sultana and the number that died were wrong. So it was only through Gene's efforts that we now believe there were 1,200, which less than died on the Titanic, but about the same number that were killed on the Arizona.
Today, despite the magnitude of this tragedy, the Sultana remains virtually unknown. Even at the time, it was merely a footnote in the news.
The war had just ended. Lee had just surrendered at Appomattox a few weeks before this disaster. Lincoln had been assassinated. Booth was killed the day the Sultana arrived in Memphis, going upriver on April 26. The papers were full of stories about the funeral, Booth, and the other co conspirators regarding the assassination. And frankly, when the Sultana, the disaster occurred, it did make the Memphis and the St. Louis papers, but the New York Times carried a story about it on the like page 5. And also, with the Titanic, we all know about the rich people, the famous people that died on it, but we don't know anything about the third class passengers who were immigrating to America. We don't know anything about them. History remembers the famous and forgets the common. And these soldiers were, from the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee. They were from the heartland of America, far removed from the big newspapers along the East Coast. And they were enlisted men. There were very few officers on the Sultana. So they were men that really had made a mark in life. And, history just forgot them. But there's another reason. And I found a newspaper article in one of the Memphis papers, a few weeks after the disaster, and I'm going to paraphrase, but the writer said that only a few days ago, 1,500 people died within sight of Memphis, and yet today it's hardly mentioned because some other event has taken its place. The nation was callous. The nation, this probably over 700,000 men died in the Civil War, more than all the casualties of all the wars that America has been involved in during the Civil War. People were callous of death. They were accustomed to reading about Gettysburg and Vicksburg and Franklin, Shiloh. They became callous. The war was over, and they didn't want to look back. They wanted to look towards the future.
The remains of the Sultana were found underground on private farmland in the 1980s, in an area that was once part of the Mississippi River, but due to the river shifting, it's now dry land. Its exact location has not been released to the public or media at the request of the families of the victims, and they do not want the site to be excavated. However, in its episode about the Sultana, the PBS investigation series History's Detectives indicated that its remains are somewhere in a bean field in Marion, Arkansas. Co host and investigator Jerry Cowan stated, "There's nothing to see there, aside from chips of old fire bricks that the boilers may have sat on. It was pretty inspiring to recognize that somewhere, beneath the floodplain of the Mississippi River, there are hundreds of Union soldiers that are probably buried down there. The fact that it's still there, it's pretty inspiring." The United States government never constructed a monument to remember the victims of the Sultana, despite the efforts of the survivors. A bill was presented in Congress in 1896 to offer pensions to the victims and their families, but the bill was never voted on. Several plaques and monuments were erected by private citizens and local governments, and these can be found in Muncie, Indiana, Memphis, Tennessee, Cincinnati, Ohio, Vicksburg, Mississippi, Knoxville, Tennessee, Mansfield, Ohio, and also Marion, Arkansas. But there are some who are fighting to keep the memory of the Sultana alive, including Jerry Potter.
I'm on the board of the Sultana Disaster Museum in Marion, Arkansas. We have a museum, and we have raised $5 million, and we're trying to raise five more to build a state of the art museum dedicated to the memory of the soldiers that were on the Sultana and the passengers. we're excited about that. We have a lot of memorabilia from the survivors. And what's interesting is on the board is Frank Fogelman, Frank Barton, and John Fogelman. John Fogelman, Leroy Fogelman, and Dallas Fogelman were alive and were residents of Mound City or near Mound City, Arkansas, and they helped rescue some of the survivors. And they were the ancestors of John Fogelman, who's on the board, and Frank Fogelman, who's the mayor of Marion, Arkansas. Frank Barton was a captain, Confederate captain, that helped rescue some of the survivors. And he is an ancestor to John and Frank Fogelman, but also is the ancestor to Frank Barton that's on the board. So there's a lot. That's the reason the museum is in Marion, because of the efforts of these men's ancestors to rescue some of the survivors of the Sultana.
Survivors of the Sultana began meeting in 1885, and they formed the Sultana Survivors Association. Survivors gathered near Toledo, Ohio every year until 1933, when 2 survivors got together for the last time. Survivors who lived in the South started meeting in 1886 in Knoxville, Tennessee. They met annually until 1930, when one lone survivor, Private Pleasant Keeble, showed up, read the log, and went home. He died just weeks later. Private Charles M. Eldridge, the last living survivor of the Sultana, died in Texas on September 8, 1941, at age 96. In 2015, the Sultana Disaster Museum opened in Marion, Arkansas. In 2019, the Arkansas General Assembly designated April 27th as Sultana Remembrance Day. The Sultana remains mostly a forgotten tale, despite being the deadliest maritime tragedy in U.S. history. Sergeant John Clark Ely, whose diary somehow survived, never did spend another Christmas with his loved ones.
If you go to the National Cemetery today, there are 28 graves that I've been able to identify that bear the names of men, soldiers that died on the Sultana. 28. Of that 28 is John Clark Ely's grave. He left a wife and 4 children in Ohio. And to me, one of the greatest tragedies of this story is the fact that 28 men or graves I've been able to identify. The hundreds of men that bodies were recovered are buried at the National Cemetery in graves that say unknown U.S. soldier. And their names and their stories have been lost forever.
That brings us to the end of our story about the Sultana. A huge thank you to Jerry Potter. It was truly an honor and a joy to speak with him about it. His book is called The Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster. And you can find it on arcadiapublishing.com, Amazon, or even better, support your local bookstore. Thank you all so much for listening. We are tremendously grateful to you, our listeners. And please don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts for you Apple folks, or podchaser.com for you Android folks. It only takes a moment, costs you nothing, and really will help people find the show. And last but not least, please tell a friend about us. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Our outstanding original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow his YouTube channel at Sean Secret. Links and images can be found in this episode's show notes. Please follow us on Instagram and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, or visit us at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. And please, do your part to protect our oceans by reducing your use of plastics. It's time to cut and run. Thanks for listening.